Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, and regulatory landscape and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site for Cybersecurity Awareness Month is Annmarie Giblin, Data Privacy and Cybersecurity Law at Norton Rose Fulbright. We have Jud Welle, Partner of Data Privacy and Cybersecurity Litigation at Goodwin. Ivan Shefrin, he's Executive Director of Managed Services at Comcast Business, and James Koenig, Partner at Troutman Pepper. We're here to discuss why cyber best practice in data governance is not a one-time exercise, but a longer-term sustainable strategy that companies need to adhere to. It is great to have all of you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks. Thank you for your participation in Cyber Awareness Month. Let's go around the table here. Annmarie, we'll start with you. When you think about the cyber and threat landscape, clearly one word to describe it is complex, but what's keeping you up at night?
Oh my God, so many things. You know, we're still in a place with cybersecurity where one bad click, one user that doesn't know what they're doing can really mess things up for a company. So mitigation, I think, would be the most important thing I would say companies should look at. And one of the risks, I think, is kind of underneath that, because companies have really strong cybersecurity infrastructure and programs, but understanding that it's going to happen at some point and catching it early and responding to it is the most important thing you can do. Another thing that keeps me up at night is just data governance generally. We really try to take a data-focused approach of there's so much regulation now, and never in this time in the world have we seen so much data being available, easily shared, but it needs to be protected. And you need to know what you have and where it's located, because when you have a cyber incident, that's really the bad day. Oh my God, I didn't realize all of this data was in that email inbox. I didn't realize all of this was in an insecure local hard drive. So understanding where your data is probably the thing that keeps me up the most at night, because when we go in and we try to do these programs, that's usually the biggest surprise to most companies is I didn't realize my data was so widespread.
And emerging technology, more data begets more data. So it's only going to snowball from here. Jud, when you think about trends, ransomware, is that still one of the biggest threats that's out there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's out of recognition that criminal gangs are organized, and so ransomware and digital extortion is big business. I think it's no longer the case that companies can be secure in the knowledge that they don't have a lot of personal information, because what the threat actors are more concerned about is pressing on a pressure point. And sometimes that can be disrupting a company's operations. It can be just embarrassing them with a massive data leak on the web. So we're seeing larger and larger sums being demanded, and it's a complicated exercise. It sometimes evolves outside of the technical and really brings the whole range of business functions together to try to understand how we're going to deal with a persistent threat actor that wants to publicize our data and really drag our reputation through the mud.
Yeah, and Ivan, it's a cat and mouse game, right? You're playing 4D chess all the time because bad actors are leveraging the same type of technology, and by the way, they're very well funded.
Very well funded, and I'm going to agree with Annmarie, what she said, which is humans are the weakest link. We can have and invest in the best technology possible, but it's not going to prevent somebody from clicking a phishing attack. And we just released the 2024 Cybersecurity Threat Report at Comcast, and one of the most important data points that came out of that and learnings was that phishing is the #1 way by far that attackers and our adversaries get inside initial access to our customers' networks. So yeah.
And the phishing that they're using right now, I mean, Jim, for certain, it's not like phishing was, 5 years ago. It is getting harder and harder to detect as the end user at the other end of the screen.
Well, artificial intelligence is making everybody more intelligent, including the threat actors. So they're able to use that to write emails that are with complete sentences, without grammar problems and things that used to be able to spot. Trademark and other things that used to build trust as you read through them, now they look a lot more similar or a lot closer. And the messages are now written in the style of the intended sender and things like that. So while the technology continues to advance, it continues to advance on both sides.
Yeah, so I guess you have to balance out mitigation versus response. That's got to be challenging as you're developing your strategy around cybersecurity. Are people doing enough when it comes to mitigation and response, or is it imbalanced one way or the other?
So for many years, up until about 10 years ago, the strategy was to build higher walls and moats around the outside of our network perimeter, and that's been proven invalid. You still have to keep strong walls and moats, but you have to be ready once people land inside, once the bad guys and our adversaries land inside. And that requires detection and response, active detection and response, and an incident response plan for when you can't detect and respond as well.
Yeah, well, part of the challenge too, Annmarie, is what are you responding for? How do you determine what's an incident, what has in fact been determined as a breach, right? And then you have, then you have to report it as well.
Well, and that's the thing, and we were talking about this a little before, where we're seeing the regulatory environment go towards reporting cyber incidents as opposed to data breach. So a cyber incident happens a million times a day for most companies, and they were able to detect them and stop them from becoming larger incidents. So what we're seeing is regulatory authorities wanting to see the bigger ones that maybe you don't have to report under data breach regulation, which is when we've determined someone's information's actually been compromised or unauthorized access. But now they want to know, have you had some type of incident that could be wormed away through the entire industry? So if you're a financial company and someone's attacking you with this new strain of malware, but they haven't stolen any information, we want to know about that now. And that really heightens the risk. So a lot of this should be done beforehand. Unfortunately, a lot of times what we see in incident response is it's being done in real time because they haven't. There wasn't budget. The last baby gets fed first, and it's usually not cybersecurity. So we kind of backtrack, and then we're talking about, did you comply with this law and this law and this law? And they're like, I didn't even know those laws existed. Yeah. So it's a very complicated thing and something you should not want to do at the time of an incident. It really should be done beforehand.
Yeah. So Jud, the question is senior leadership, board members, are they becoming more engaged on cyber threats and defenses? Are they prioritizing this?
I think it's turning the tanker around, but yes, it's starting to move in that direction. Our team spends a lot of time with board education and C-level preparation exercises, tabletop exercises. Part of what we do are educators and we're translators. We're helping bridge that gap between the technical and business decisions and executive analysis. Businesses are consistently thinking about cyber as enterprise risk. And in fact, I think that's what the regulators are driving companies to adopt. They don't want this to be a siloed function. Yeah. They don't want just to be a back office function. It involves strategy, and there is real risk to investors when it comes to a company failing to treat it that way.
Yeah, and Jim, we were talking about this off camera, but not looking at cyber as a cost, but a value add to the company. You don't hear about cyber as much as other sector lines of business, such as product and revenue generation and so forth. But to Jud's point, having that bird's eye view and not just the silo that you're focused on within the organization is key.
Yeah, the investment in cyber has always been table stakes to protect the company and the organization. But now, with the hope of many new technologies from AI to facial recognition, voice, autonomous vehicles, all sorts of other things, security is critical to maintaining trust and to continue consumer adoption and eventually realizing the profits and the value that comes from those new technologies. So things like cyber, which used to be maybe 5 to 10% of the total IT budget, are now growing to 5 to 15%. And for companies with new technology products, it can reach up to 20% to make sure that security for the new products and the new information and the volumes of information being generated are properly secured as part of the new product offerings.
And Ivan, that's a challenge, right? Let's use generative AI as an example. There's that rush to get it within the enterprise to create more efficiencies, and of course, you want to have that product externally as well. How do you balance that rush to go to market with the risk assessment?
It's a challenge for any company, whether you're in technology or not, because you've got to get products out the door and you've got to produce them inexpensively. And yet, with a growing awareness at the board and shareholder level, it's critical to take security, and what we say in the business is, as security practitioners, is shift left. Build security in from the start, not after the fact. But it's a process, and it's not just large enterprises that have this challenge. And Comcast has 2.5 million mid-market business customers, and it's a much greater challenge there because they're really laser focused on their business, and they don't have the additional cash and resources and people and skills that are required to do this. So
Annmarie, is the tech stack just too big at this point, right? Think about the past 5-6 years, that migration to the cloud was what enterprise needed to do to keep up with competition. Then we had COVID and everyone's working hybrid. Now Gen AI is part of the consumer vernacular. So all of these changes just in the past 5-6 years, the tech stack expands, there's more third parties, there's more vulnerabilities. How do you triage that?
Well, it actually is better when there's a larger tech stack, because when we see too much concentration of just one vendor, one type of software, that's actually a risk in of itself. It's a supply chain risk. What happens if that third party is hacked or unavailable for some reason? How quickly can you migrate over to another version of that? So when you see a company with several different types of software and technologies embedded, it actually shows me that they're thinking about business continuity and disaster recovery, because they can quickly then re-up maybe the smaller version of email that they're using or a different cloud provider, and they have that ready to go. It's actually more concerning when you only see 2 or 3 providers in there. And with regards to another window into your, we always say cyber is a house, you can lock the entire door, but if you leave every window open, what are you doing, right? That's another window into your environment, but using contracts and the ways that third-party vendors now have their own obligations, you can manage that risk. It really goes back down to, again, data, data minimization. What do they need? What access do they need? And making that as small as possible. So it definitely is a thought risk process, but having more vendors is actually a good thing in most cases.
Yeah. Jud, I want to talk about the evolving regulatory environment. I have so many questions here. And when we spoke on a prior panel together, one of the things that we brought up was standardization around that, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all black box. There's different sizes of businesses. There's different amounts of people in businesses. Your risk tolerance varies from leadership to leadership.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Not every company is built out the same way and will be able to address these complex challenges with the same playbook. But I do think that there are some best practices. I think one is to look at how you're relying on outsource partners for critical technology needs, particularly security. The regulatory landscape is changing on this, particularly when it comes to AI, but also cybersecurity. There's more prescriptive regulations coming online requiring certain rigor and controls to be in place. If you don't have an internal champion that's 100% focused on your business, and rather you're relying on someone who's dealing with your business alongside 50 others from a managed service standpoint, it's not to say that there aren't great efficiencies to be gained by having outsourcing. It's that when you have a cyber strategy, it really, I think, has to be brought internally, because CFOs, COOs, CEOs, and boards, they're busy running the business, right? They're not going to understand the cyber risk. And what I think we've all talked about here is that the threats are evolving, and staying on top of what's happening today versus 5 years ago is really key. So how you do that, putting that responsibility with someone that sits outside your organization, I think it's going to very quickly become impossible to do, especially if you're in any kind of regulated industry, let alone a publicly traded company.
We were talking about that again off camera, Ivan, right? If you're in financial services, clearly heavily regulated, who's reporting on that? The CISO's organization or registered compliance folks, the ones that have to do it? That's 2 very different languages.
It's got to be everybody, the entire executive leadership of the company or organization. It can't be just the CISO and the security team. It can't be the compliance, can't be the legal team. And it can't be the CEO himself. So it's got to be a combined effort, and that's what I typically recommend to all my customers and clients.
But Jim, is there a framework in place for who is responsible for this when it comes to the reporting?
Well, cyber's a team sport, and everybody brings their own frameworks, whether it's the legal, the regulatory, compliance group, and security. And 20 years ago, in the first security case at the FTC, I was the expert to the FTC, and we didn't pick a standard. Very heavily debated. We said the reasonable administrative, technical, and physical safeguard, and that's promoted a lot of inconsistency through the years. So now there has been, under the current FTC administration, for the first time, they're naming specific security controls and permitting certain different frameworks to be approved. So whether it's ISO, or whether it's NIST because it's government, or PCI because you're dealing with credit card data, there are much more focus on requiring industry-recognized standards. And companies now are building them, assessing in advance, and the most important thing up front, the best protection for privacy and security, is not to have the data at all. So back to the data minimization point, but architecting into the product so you don't actually oversave information, but you save what's critical so you can feed AI, but not create a cyber risk at the same time.
Right. Well, let's talk about more data governance. You know, your recommendations in terms of a longer-term sustainable strategy, not just for the C-suite, but for everyone in the enterprise.
But also it goes back to what you were saying too, the value add, because I think a lot of companies are missing the fact that data is a valuable commodity. And if you are organizing and protecting and know where it all lives and how you can desanitize it and use it in different ways, you actually have a new revenue stream. And a lot of companies miss that, especially with AI. Right now, they are looking for clean data to use to train large language models. How are we developing generative AI and other different types of algorithms that are going to be the future of what we're looking at for emerging technologies? So if done right, if you are very thoughtful of, data is regulated by its type. We want to be very careful with the types of data that have the most stringent regulation, but if we can cut and slice and dice it and make it a de-identified, anonymous data set that's really valuable, well, now I've just paid for my entire cyber program. So being really thoughtful about that, I think, is key.
And be able to communicate that effectively as well. I mean, if you're communicating to the board or to your CFO looking for, you know, capital to allocate to this, you have to speak in those types of terms, not so much the technical jargon.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, it comes down to business opportunity versus the risk tolerance, and sometimes having a thoughtful conversation at a strategic level before you've raced a product out, you can unlock different markets where if you had only engineered the product to meet certain security standards, you might be able to sell more of that product and be in other jurisdictions where there are trends emerging that are going to suggest it's going to be table stakes to have proper governance, to have your assets and data mapped and managed.
Yeah.
And so it all sort of feeds together, but I think gone are the days that you're well served by just rushing a product out and thinking about security on the back end. I think it does have to be by design, and I think bringing a real risk-informed perspective into the higher level strategic and risk management conversations is the key.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue, Jim, that data is the biggest commodity that a company has.
Absolutely. And that the world right now, as we're focusing on AI in particular, we're thinking about the tools and the public large language models and the threats to intellectual property. But that's today. If you look ahead just a couple of years, companies are going to be, law firms, consulting firms, even technology development firms are going to be competing on the quality of the curated databases that they build and have internally. So right now, people don't always see that future, but you're going to grab something from LexisNexis, or you're going to grab something from Bloomberg, and plus your own layer. And if you focus on that layer, well, you may not have deleted when it was a record retention issue, but now if you delete old versions or the not final version of reports and make sure your data quality is improved, you'll be able to compete with better, more accurate intelligence and with AI models that don't drift or that potentially are fair and don't have discrimination purposes. So investing in those things now is really what will keep companies competitive going forward. And starting with cyber, table stakes for now, and that will help you realize the long-term value.
And you can't mention Bloomberg without mentioning Nasdaq data.
Of course, yes, good plug for that. I mean, you know, even internally, what we are doing with Gen AI, and of course, I mean, all the data that we have here at Nasdaq is fascinating. When you had said this conversation could look very different even 2 years from now, I think that is incredibly exciting. I mean, it could look
2 minutes from now.
Because as we said before, Annmarie, data begets data, right? And once it's clean and structured and what you can do with it from there, I realize it's scary in the context of cyber, but it's exciting. This conversation will look very different even 6 months from now.
So I want to tell you a quick anecdote, because Annmarie really had the right of it, and Jud followed up this well, which is like most companies don't know what the attack surface is. They don't know not only where their data is, but where all the critical assets are. Without getting technical, when a CISO comes in in a new role in a new organization, that's generally speaking the first thing they do. Where's my data? And very few organizations can answer it. On the flip side, it's also an opportunity to mine and create new sources of revenue and value.
So in the last 30 seconds here, what is the right answer? Where is my data? What should that governance look like?
I'm not a lawyer, playing on one team, so I don't want to talk about government.
Yeah, I think, you know, Jim mentioned before, cyber is a team sport, data governance is also a team sport, right? You can't just expect a data governance professional or a CISO or a head of technology to understand the data. There has to be strong relationships with the business, and everyone has to be rowing in the same direction. So as long as you have that connective tissue there and you're practicing, whether it's a cyber exercise or data governance exercise, I think that's going to, you know, help close the gap.
Hear, hear.
And we'll leave that on a positive note. Appreciate everyone's insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.